First reading is from the book of Isaiah, chapter 6, verses 6 to 12. Then one of the seraphs flew to me, holding a live coal that had been taken from the altar with a pair of tongs. The seraph touched my mouth with it and said, "Now that this has touched your lips, your guilt has departed and your sin is blotted out." Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, "Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" And I said, "Here am I, send me." And he said, "Go and say this to people. Keep listening, but do not comprehend. Keep looking, but do not understand. Make the mind of this people dull, and stop their ears and shut their eyes, so that they may not look with their eyes or listen with their ears, and comprehend with their minds, and turn and be healed." Then I said, "How long, O Lord?" And he said, "Until cities lie waste without inhabitant, and houses without people, and the land is utterly desolate, until the Lord sends everyone far away, and vast is the emptiness and the midst of the land." This is the gospel of the word.
Thanks be to Christ. Amen.
Good morning. The second Bible reading is taken from Matthew 25, verses 14 to 30. For it is as if a man going on a journey summoned his slaves and entrusted his property to them. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. The one who had received the 5 talents went off at once and traded them and made 5 more talents. In the same way, the one who had the 2 talents made 2 more talents. But the one who had received the 1 talent went off and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of the slaves came and settled accounts with them. Then the one who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 more talents, saying, Master, you had handed over to me 5 talents. See, I have made 5 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. And the one with the 2 talents came forward, saying, Master, you have handed me over to me 2 talents. See, I have made you 2 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. Then the one who had received the 1 talent also came forward, saying, Master, I knew you were a harsh man, reaping you did not sow, and gathering where you did not scatter seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours. But his master replied, You wicked and lazy slave. You knew, did you, that I reap where I did not sow and gather where I did not scatter? Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and on my return I would have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to the one with the 10 talents. For to all those who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. As for this worthless slave, throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Thanks, Roshan. Let us pray. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart and all our hearts be pleasing to you, O Lord, our rock and our salvation. Amen. Good morning, everyone. Most of you might be a bit puzzled when you hear today's gospel reading. What does the parable of the talent have to do with Advent? Well, any long-time churchgoer can attest that we normally read this story as all about stewardship, that we should consider how much God has given us so we can decide how much to give back, whether it be money or abilities to serve the church or other forms of resources. In America, where I've spent a long time, you may hear something a bit therapeutic from this passage. Give, because it's good for you to let go some of what you have on a regular basis. Or perhaps you may hear something motivational or self-empowering. Be like servant number 1 and number 2. Aim to double up God's investment in you so that you may enter into the joy of your master. Or in Asia, you may hear something more religious or more pious. If you talk to a church or home sim, you will definitely hear something like that, I think. Tithe, not only so the church can keep on running, but also because it is the Lord's portion. Don't end up like servant number 3, not just wicked and lazy, but worthless, unworthy of anything from the master, but being thrown into the outer darkness. Well, this way of reading actually could find its support in a history of interpretation from Western biblical scholarship, and here's a brief survey. This is a story of a man whom over-caution and cowardice led to a breach of trust. The punishment for neglected opportunity is deprivation of opportunity. The third servant's refusal to risk led to repressed guilt, resulting in the loss of the opportunity for a meaningful existence. Out of fear of failure, he refused to even try to succeed. Well, with all these kinds of interpretation already established in the back of our mind, no wonder we are surprised to see this text in Advent, a text about money and stewardship in a season of waiting of Christ coming. But what if I tell you that what you're about to hear is not what you might expect? That this parable is not so much about stewardship, at least not the kind that you might think. Let me sow the first seed of doubt in you by sharing something I heard from a student from rural China. He was born and raised in the mainland, and his parents were not very educated. They were farmers, but the student was very bright, very hardworking, and he worked his way up to one of the top universities in the country. And after being introduced to this parable and reading it for the first time, not knowing that this is actually part of the Bible, but of an English literature class about Milton, the Paradise Lost, he looked at the teacher and said, "Isn't this a showcase of the ugly side of Western capitalism?" What we see from something has a lot to do with how or from where we see it. What about the people in Jesus' day? How would they have heard this parable? First of all, they would immediately identify that the master in the parables had to be an aristocrat, a wealthy elite, the only people who have that kind of talent to throw around in those days, which was a large sum of convertible asset in an agrarian society that weighted between about 80 to 130 pounds. When we're talking about 160 years of an average salary of not domestic helpers, but professionals, accountants, lawyers, auditors, HR directors, etc., etc. Because a talent was worth roughly 20 years worth of the labor of an ordinary servant. And the servant, they were household retainers. First century overlords, financiers, they often had to be abroad, to be away. And they had to hire people to look after things when they're away. Domestic bureaucrats, to be in charge of managing workers, keeping the books, collecting debts. Slaves, they may be called, but are well-placed ones because they were free to make a little something for themselves on the side once they have seen to the master's interests. The high-ups were entrusted with more than the lower downs, and whatever the rank, their dependence on the master was built into the system. They lived on his excess. The better he did, the better they did. Their wealth derived from him. So a master who shares a little venture capital with his retainers when he's away was not only increasing his own joy, he was inviting them into it as well. Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come now, enjoy the joy of your master. You are now part of the game. So how did this master get the money? Well, the usual way. They engage in trade and commerce. They ran import-export businesses and lent money to people at interest, especially the land-poor people who often had trouble trying to make ends meet at the end of a long drought or a serious illness in the family. And wealthy householders in those days were happy to help in those circumstances. There was nothing to it. I mean, if you're strapped for cash, you got the best interest rate you could, you put up your land as collateral, and you got busy bringing in the sheaves. But by the time you notice what 60% interest rate really meant, it was too late. And when your land went into foreclosure, that did not mean that you always have to leave. You can stay and work for your former lender so long as you're willing to work, so long as you could stand to watch your family's fields being repurposed as vineyards or olive groves, something more easily monetized that would appeal to a more upscale market. That is what the people in Jesus' days would have heard this story. Hear this parable like that student from rural China, or one of the little ones that followed Jesus around in those days, or even one of Filipino helpers that worship among us, or that little old lady with a crooked back pushing the trolley around Central, surviving on picking up used cardboards. It can be hard, very hard, to see the master as anything but one more tycoon sitting on a pile of cash so high that he couldn't see the bottom of it, which is why he has to hire people to keep it flowing up from wherever it comes without troubling him with too much details. And as long as they can double his money, they are welcome to make it any way they like. They may deduct their fees to the full extent of the law, which has been generously amended so that people like the master can go on stimulating the economy. Barbara Brown Taylor, a well-known preacher, in her sermon, The Parable of the Fearful Investor, to which this sermon is indebted, she puts it poignantly. She said, "Here's what I'd like to know. When did we decide that the man going on the journey in the parable was God? How did we turn the little M master in the story into a capital big M master of the world? Seriously? Are we seriously supposed to believe that the first two servants in the parables are the praiseworthy ones, both in this life, this world and the next, for making a wealthy man wealthier, for keeping an absentee landlord in business, for scoring 100% rate of return for him in exchange for their own piece of the pie? While the third one, the only one who buries the talent where it cannot do any more harm in the system, the only one who tells the truth about the master, not behind his back but to his face, the only one who refuses to play the game any longer, even if it means being banished from his master's expensive joy. He is the one whose overcaution and cowardice have cost him the opportunity for meaningful existence. It shouldn't take long for you actually to know that the land policy in Hong Kong is one of the most profound issues in the city. That the most unaffordable housing market in the world is not Manhattan, not Singapore, or London, or any other world city, but in Hong Kong here. That the disparity between the rich and the poor is at a 45-year historic high. That the richest 10% earns 44 times than that of the poorest. Though we pride ourselves as a world financial center, objectively unbiased and transparent financial planning is basically non-existent to those who need it the most, because every service or products or instruments, even if they can afford to buy, is commission-based. Is built into the system. And those good and trustworthy fee-only advisors only serve high net worth clients. As I work on this sermon, I have been trying very hard to imagine Jesus walking in Hong Kong, imagining him walking in areas that used to be farmlands but now have been gentrified into a high-rise of nano flats, walking in Central alongside with that cardboard lady and say, "Peace, peace be with you, and then walk away. Or say, I've come for my profit. What? No profit? Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers. And on my return, I would have received what was my own with interest. Somebody come, take away the little bit she has here on her trolley and give it to those who earn 44 times more. For to those who have, more will be given. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. And you know what? I can't imagine that. I can't imagine that at all. But I can imagine what the old lady or that mainland student from China or even a helper in our midst would say about that third servant. Of course the master would throw him out. He could not have someone in the household exposing the truth, that he gathered where he had not put anything, and he harvested where he did not sow. And as for the outer darkness, where there's wailing and gnashing of teeth, do you really believe that's God's own hell? Or if it's just the truth about where whistleblowers really go once they have decided that they cannot go on the way they used to before anymore. So, if servant number 3 is actually the hero in the parable, not number 1 and 2, that the master in the story is not God, that this parable is not so much about stewardship, what then is this parable about? Why are we reading it today? This is a parable about hope. It is here to reset the hope of the disciples rightly in the heavenly kingdom as they continue to endure the systemic economic injustice of the earthly kingdoms of the time. It is read today to revive our hope in God and His interventions as we struggle to see them in light of the darkness Hong Kong has seen, especially over this year. It is here to reset and revive our hope. The parable is part of a long answer to the questions asked by the disciples in the chapter before this. In Matthew 24, after Jesus foretold the destruction of the temple, along with its corrupted economy within, the disciples asked, "Tell us, Rabbi, when will this be? What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" They were asking when Jesus will establish His kingdom. They thought He was about to overthrow all the corruption, all the injustice with His divine power. But what Jesus is saying with this parable as an answer to that is that when you see a social economy so crooked like that, that is when my kingdom will come. But it will not come in the way you expected. Up to that point in Matthew, from chapter 21, Jesus has cleansed the temple, He has cursed the fruitless fig tree, He denounced the Pharisees and the blind religious leader, and He wept for the city of Jerusalem for its brokenness. After seeing all of that and all the mighty acts Jesus did, the disciples thought Jesus was the Messiah that they have been waiting for, the kind of militant, religious, political king that they have been wishing for. That's the kind of messianic hope that they have been fixated on. But it was a false hope. Jesus knew that was not what Scriptures meant for the true Messiah to be and do, and it wasn't how He's about to fulfill them. How often do we, including Christians, especially long-time Christians and church leaders, me included first of all, of course, we hold on to our established interpretations of Scriptures, our own ideas about heaven, existing mindset about God, expectations of what the kingdom looks like. We hold on to deep-seated and cultural and traditional understanding of how the kingdom should come, and fixated ideas about how a church should be and how ministry should be done, or how a song should be sung and should sound like. That's how God will come in those moments. Those deep-seated ideas misguide us to look for God in our own narrow and particular ways, in our particular wishes and expectations. They blind us from seeing beyond our habits of seeing. They block us from hearing with the heart and stop us from perceiving the true hope of the kingdom. And that's the problem of the Pharisees. And all the way up to Matthew chapter 10, Jesus had been preaching the message of the kingdom plainly and doing many miracles to validate its message and to reveal its dawning. He healed the sick, he cleansed the leper, he calmed the sea, he cast out demons, he opened the eyes of the blind and unstopped the ears of the deaf. But the people kept listening, but did not comprehend. They kept looking, but did not understand. Even the Pharisees, especially the teachers of the law of scriptures, were so spiritually blind and deaf, so fixated on their own hopes and expectations of the Messiah, so much so that the chosen servant of God, the Messiah himself, the very Son of God, finally came and stood right before them. They completely missed it. They couldn't see it. So they don't follow him. They rejected him. Even he tried to kill him and get rid of him. When we don't see God intervening the way we think he ought to in the world or in the church, we easily get puzzled. We feel perplexed. We ask why, and then we become disillusioned and despair. And then eventually we may feel a bit jaded and bitter or even cynical. And when our own set of expectations and presuppositions are unsettled or even challenged, we can even get desperate and angry, and we argue. I know one of the things that gets some Christians down is when, from a very narrow view of God, that the Christian faith is being boiled down and reduced to something just about an inner peace for people to endure the private pain inflicted by a systemic injustice or structural sin and evil in the world, and does nothing about it. Just an inner peace. No wonder so many people think of accepting Christ as getting a ticket to heaven, and they delay coming to faith for as long as they could, as if there's going to be some last-minute deal. And of course, there's the other side too, the exact opposite view, that it is the social justice stuff that is disturbing, unsettling, and upsetting, because it's just too political. Let's stick with prayer and Bible studies. But Jesus wants us to see beyond all that. He wants us to rekindle our hope, not in our own versions of the kingdom, but in the heavenly kingdom, which is far beyond all the different perspectives and imaginations combined. It's way beyond that. That's why he must reset our hope, our narrow, small, tiny little hope, but by first unsettling our own way of seeing. He wants us to see beyond it so that we might perceive with our heart, so that we might see glimpses of heaven and hear the echoes of hope, true hope, real big hope. And so Jesus' parables upsets us sometimes to get us unstuck from those fixations. And that's what parables do, right? Matthew 13, when told us Jesus told many things about the kingdom of God in parables, and the disciples asked, why? Why parables? And then Jesus quoted the psalm in the call to worship today and the Old Testament reading in Isaiah that we read today. And at first glance, it seems that Jesus actually did so to hide, to conceal the kingdom from those who reject him, so they will never get it. So they will be left in darkness. But no, get this. Parable, at its root, means riddles. When's the last time you play riddles? what do? They use familiar language and vocabularies, or familiar objects or phenomena to get people think and wonder, to see it differently, to see things differently, to see beyond the old and ordinary way of seeing, so that they might start to hear with their hearts and see glimpses of a higher meaning, glimpses of the kingdom of heaven. And in turn, when they finally see the kingdom, and when they finally see Jesus as the fulfillment of it, they will find comfort and they will be healed. So in fact, the fact that Jesus spoke in parables shows his understanding and grace, that he was delivering the message of hope, not with easy believism, but with the most empathetic way possible. So our gospel reading today is a riddle of hope. It's here to unsettle our old ways of seeing, to puzzle us into new ways of seeing and hearing, to help us understand with our heart and inner spirit, to reset our hope and expectation so that we may hope in him again. There's still one last thing missing, one last piece, missing piece of the puzzle here. We actually haven't solved this riddle. Why? Because this parable actually doesn't have a happy ending. The third servant got thrown into outer darkness. The hero was sacrificed. So how can we hear hope from this riddle? And I will stop here, like Jesus stopped. I'll let you think about it, maybe discuss it among yourselves. Maybe join one of the discipleship course and we can discuss about what is the meaning and understand the explanation of the riddle. But when you get it, when you see how this third servant points to the ultimate and final servant, you will find hope and be healed, even in the darkest moment of our time. Amen.